Welcome to the third episode of Behind the Regs. I'm Jack and I'm joined by my co-host Nader and our guest today, Andy from Planet Building Control. Andy, if you would kindly tell us a little bit about yourself and then we can get into some of the topics for today.
Sure, no problem. My name is Andy Crooks. I've been in building control for about 35 years. I've been in the industry for 38 years in total. My specialism is within the field of building regulations as they apply to any development, whether it's small domestic property or high rise. My qualifications and background is I came in the days when you could qualify professionally using HND and via an exam route. And then I sat the IBC exams. IBC was the Institution of Building Control, and it consisted of 7 Part 2s post my HND and then 3 Part 3s. We then had to do a 10,000 word dissertation and keep a diary for a couple of years that was monitored and mentored. And it was an interesting development that took me on a journey into building control education. So my master's degree is just a management degree. It isn't anything special. My formal qualifications are I'm a chartered fellow of RICS, chartered fellow of CABE. I've been a fire engineer, NMI fire engineer since 2002. And I'm also a registered class 3H and 4 building inspector. My background in terms of past and present positions is that obviously I've now set up as a building safety consultant. I'm also a director of a fire stopping company and have been for around about 15 years or so. I've managed building control teams in the private sector for around about 17, 18 years prior to coming out of that existence in March. I was a CEO of JHAI and exec director of Stroma. And then I've had various different appointments in that time. The first half of my career I was 17 years in local government, actually enforcing the regulations, and then came out in 2007 into private practice. I think I would say, my big involvement has been sort of assessing building control capability for years. I started off as an IBC assessor years ago, back in 1997, shortly after I'd actually qualified myself. I'm now an assessor and a chairman and an auditor for the RICS. I'm also a panel assessor for CABE, and I'm a panel assessor for total training and development on the building control competency assessment, which is one of the government approved qualifying registration schemes for RBIs. So that tends to be my background. Beyond my professional roles, I suppose I've played a fairly significant role in shaping the building control profession. I've held various positions both within the CIC-AIR, SICA, and I've also sat on the HSE committees in my service to the Association of Building Control Approvers, an association that I'm still involved in. And I suppose I've most recently been a consultant to the government's ministry, the MHCLG and also the HSE in respect to the development of the legislation as it was. I'm also a published author of the 14th edition of the Building Regulations Explained and Illustrated, which was published back in 2017. And we're currently working, myself and a couple of fellow authors, Mike Billington, who used to be my university lecturer, or Polytechnic lecturer, going back that long. And that's scheduled for publication in 2026 to account for the legislative changes and that have been rather substantial over the past few years. I've written various articles for RICS and CABE, and I tend to do building consultancy these days and just relax into a 2 or 3 day week, but I'm still fairly active in the politics of building control as well.
That's great. Thank you for that, Andy. Obviously, I first met you at one of the events you did for approved inspectors and Integral, which I thought was a great CPD event to to attend. There was a lot of information which sort of clarified a lot of points for me, but education and competency is one of the big things in the industry at the minute. Um, I think something that would be interesting to hear your view on is in respect of BICoF, how would you explain that to someone coming into the sector? What are the key points that you think would be prominent to understand?
I think what you need to do is what BICoF actually does is it has three core elements of competence that investigates the competency of the person that sat in front of them. Even if you're a class one, which is effectively a trainee or somebody preparing, a graduate that's coming in and sort of preparing, the way that BICoF actually works is it takes you through various different levels depending on the height and complexity of a particular building. And it assesses your capability about certain technical competencies, delivery competencies, and then management competencies. And the depth of knowledge that you need to have is prescribed over 4 levels. There's an expectation when it comes to ethics that you have the same competency level. It should be extreme, so that should form a priority for all trainees, just to make sure that they're familiar with the way that the expectations of the behaviours are prescribed, because there is no difference between the ethics that somebody who's an experienced manager should display by comparison to the by comparison to the average trainee, if you like. We all should be following the same principles. There are I think there's 9 competency levels within that are investigated inside the BICoF. We have law, we have technology, we have building services within the technology competence umbrella, if you like. Within the service delivery, obviously that looks towards making sure that we're familiar with our registered functions and activities, making sure that we can check a plan, making sure that we can inspect and also enforce the building regulations. And then you have 3 management competencies, which is management and core skills, which involve things like the codes for professional conduct. If you're going to say something like class 4, which would be the technical manager grade, you can just tick a box and get class 4, which I believe is a mistake, because there are certainly people who aren't familiar with the class 4 standards that are out there, and maybe just ticking that box and it's easy to be accepted. And then, they're looking at also things like the operational standards rules, these now legally bound rules under the Building Act, Section 58Z of the Building Act, which you must follow. And then the safety management principles and also the ethical approach as well. So that's, I guess, how I would explain it. There's 4 levels of inspector. You start at class 1, which is your trainee grade, those preparing to actually qualify, if you like. You also have a few players at class 1 that are probably fairly long in the tooth and probably should be a class 2 or 3, but are working under a class 2 or 3 supervision. And this is where it becomes you can only operate and undertake restricted activities, that's to check plans and inspect sites autonomously within the confines of your band. If you're actually a class 2, which deals with various aspects of building, there's around about 6 classifications of inspector, depending on the height and complexity of those buildings, between 2A and 2F. And they can operate in buildings up to 18 metres. And then you have class 3G surveyors that deal with buildings of any height which are of more non-standard construction. It may well be that standard construction to yourself and Nader is cob construction, but I don't know anything about it at all. So it's about the approach towards that non-standard construction. And also buildings above 18 metres that aren't high-rise residential buildings that maybe need a moderately complex approach towards their means of escape and use codes such as the BS 9999 moderately complex approach to commercial fire safety. Or if the HRB is a hospital, then you'd need a fairly detailed knowledge of the Health and Technical Memorandum 0502 to actually understand the means of escape criteria within those particular buildings, and also how to prepare and consider things like fire and emergency files having regard to what's operationally needed to be able to maybe evacuate high dependency patients or critical care patients and keep them healthy as they can be as they evacuate from the ward that's on fire into the adjacent wards, and making sure that staff can communicate and that sort of thing. There's also 3H, which is the high-rise residential building. In England, high-rise residential is just something which is above 18 metres or 6 stories in height, or at least 7 stories in height, and contains at least 2 dwellings. In Wales, although they haven't got a fully developed suite of legislation yet, the differing approach will be that LABC are the only people that can actually consider HRBs within Wales, provided that they're appropriately classed, and also there's only a requirement for 1 dwelling to be within the building. So that's how I would explain the BICoF in a nutshell and the capabilities of that.
You
There
mentioned
are some questions that come from that, Jack, the most obvious of which is, why are we allowing managers to just tick a box?
that is the question I have for
I
you.
was just about to come to that one.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake. I think what we need to do is we need to build the competence and measure the competence of managers that are actually running either small or large organizations. You know, that this is about regulators that have to follow particular operational standards rules. Those operational standards rules are all about making sure that you have adequate systems and controls in place, that the people that are actually doing the job are trained accordingly and they're not going beyond the scope of their registration, and that they're supported in their CPD. We need to make sure that the quality assurance, the quality management systems are in place, not necessarily formally, but in place to actually dictate the expectation of the inspectors, and also that you can enforce and intervene in relation to those particular issues that come up, that typically regulators deal with, that make sure that you're following legal procedure quite precisely, in making sure that you're ensuring safety and the principles of the building regulations in the very first section of the Building Act. You know, it's about the health, safety, welfare, and convenience of people in and around building, water consumption, security, sustainable construction, conservation of fuel and power. All of that stuff is actually the principles of what we're trying to ensure safety within those buildings or people affected within those buildings. So we need to be able to make sure that duty holders are competent to be able to do their job and follow the legal procedures to insist that they're getting the job right. And I think there's a very contrived route from a management point of view that needs to ensure that. Obviously, the QMS needs to be procedurally as close to perfection as you can possibly get. You need to have people internally that are legally good enough to support their surveyors when they come across less compliant works or less compliant people, in order that they can enforce that function. And you frankly need to take ownership of it. So to see it as a tick box seems to me to be a mistake. I know that there are 2 peer-reviewed approaches, both with the BCCA and CABE, where they do actually measure the competence of technical managers. I think the BSCF, which tends to be the local authority building control route of qualification through examination, I think they should develop that into being a competence in its own right, so they can actually measure the effectiveness of their managers. I say their managers because there's people within the private sector that have used it as well. But I believe that's what we should be actually checking. There are particular rules for companies as well. Obviously, LABC have to have their own QMS, and they do have a very good QMS, which is promoted by local authority building control. And RBCAs, of course, have additional rules to follow when it comes to the principles of the professional conduct rules, and they look similar but aren't the same precisely as the code of conduct that building inspectors actually talk about. So it talks about complying with legal standards. It talks about the business requirements. It talks about professional competence and continuing professional development. It talks about the standard of service expectations, and it talks about engaging with applicants and agents as well. And there are various annexes that you need to follow. The other part of it as well, it's essential that the BSR can measure the effectiveness of the building control bodies and the individuals that they register. And also there are other operational monitoring arrangements that again are statutorily, so RBCAs and local authority building control have to put returns into the BSR so the BSR can see how effectively they're working. So when an RBCA cancels a job for whatever reason, then essentially we know that the continuity of control is there. So they have the power and statistics now to be able to do something about that and actually address it. And we're audited against these standards. Now, I know that in any audit, generally speaking, the first one is a learning exercise, but the second audit won't be. The second audit, like they used to do with SICA, the second audit will be a very contrived route to making sure that best practice is actually being adopted. So I think it's the class 4 is a political hot potato, and we need to make sure that the future managers of building control, those who are actually responsible for managing, are actually being measured against the capability to do so. And I think that's probably going to become more important after the first 5 years of operation, when the license comes up for reconsideration. The SICA procedures, when it came to approved inspectors, they looked at this in an awful lot more detail than the BSR did last time. They were just checking the fitness to operate, interviewing staff, making sure that people rudimentarily knew what they're doing. The standards of approved inspectors were pretty good, but of course, with local authority building control, it's they're moving into a regulated industry where they haven't been regulated for many, many years. So we need to make sure that those guys are actually geared up to be able to provide the same level of management competency as anybody else. And I think there should be a lot more courses out there put on by both LABC and RBCAs and the ABCA, the Association of Building Control Approvers, Local Authority Building Control Services, that do a sterling job at supporting their local authorities. They need to make sure that they're gearing their managers up for the future to actually provide them with a much more contrived approach on management competencies. They've certainly got the paperwork there to support them. They've certainly got the education and training there, but I think something much more akin to making sure that the managers within both the private and public sector are competent, that would be a much, much, much better place, much more comforting place. I think when I came out to see your organisation, Jack, we were talking about aligning the expectations of building control with those of the building control bodies, because if they don't align, if you're not following these procedures as you should do, the RBI is actually directly responsible for his own action as undertaking that function. And that function of the registered building control approver or the local authority building control section, or indeed the BSR, can be compromised quite early if they're not following their own procedures. So procedural compliance becomes extremely important and valuable to the RBI, so they can pick up something to catalogue where they are in the process of it and actually follow it. The implications are, if you don't follow those procedures as an RBI, then they're going to be extreme for you personally. That is the point. So an RBCA can't undertake its function, an LABC can't undertake its function, the BSR can't undertake its function without taking the advice of the RBI, but they need to be doing that within the confines of making sure that it complies with the operational standards rules.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I like about where I work is we have good set policies and procedures in place, and the systems are really good to ensure that you're staying on the right path and you're not sort of going a bit wayward. It's a bit of a fail safe. You've got to really do something wrong to miss with the systems we use, which I think is very good because they do get updated constantly, which can be good and can also be a little bit annoying from time to time when something's changed, but it's all for the best purpose of making sure that we're safe in what we're doing as well. So good systems and good practices will make a difference on making sure that no lines are crossed and we're doing the right thing as we go.
Yeah.
I've got a question, Andy, actually.
Sure.
So, as we all understand and know, obviously, and you just mentioned, a building control body cannot carry out its function without the advice of an RBI. So the RBI sits at like the I'm not going to say the top of the hierarchy, but obviously they are both on the same level, so they need each other to fulfill the restricted function and activity. But for individuals to become RBIs, they go through these competency assessments. And if the competency assessment schemes are not inconsistent in assessment, then not all RBIs carrying the same class of registration are the same. Rather than when these schemes were developed, they should have developed under one single framework.
It's very much limited in terms of the frameworks that need to be followed as an organisation. There's only really the operational standards rules, which apply pretty much to LABC and RBC8. And although the BSR don't need to follow them, they follow the Nolan principles of service delivery. They do actually sort of follow the principles of them in essence. The code of conduct for building inspectors, the thing that we sign up to, and the principles are exactly the same as the professional conduct rules. It's just that professional conduct rules are framed in such a way that that's about the actual business activity, and the code of conduct is about, making sure that we're honest, that we act with integrity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and in delivering that service. The point is that it's a little bit circular. The function can't be undertaken, as you suggest, unless they've taken the advice of a registered building inspector. But the organisation is also there to support that building inspector and act as its insurance house. And I think it needs to work that way, even though we can be individually criticised for our undertaking of procedural compliance, if you like, legal compliance, administrative compliance as individuals. If you compare it to a health authority, if somebody's failed in Bristol in heart surgeries, they're not going to strike off the health authority. So the RBCAs are likely to survive. The LABC sections are likely to survive, no matter what the penalties are within Section 58 of the Building Act. They're likely to survive unless something goes severely wrong. The people who are going to be up for criticism is going to be the individual RBIs. They're going to weed out the bad ones of those. And I know it's a scary prospect, but this is where I think the management capability of the organisation becomes extremely important to make sure that the fitness of the procedures, and they do this through the audits anyway, to make sure that the fitness of the procedures and that their competence is assured through, training that they're duty bound to actually put in place, making sure they've got the right people talking to them about the right things, that they're prepared for changing legislation and that sort of thing. So they're most definitely aligned, but the synergists, they need to knit together extremely well. It's all very well looking at the competence of registered building inspectors, but if they live within, an organisation, whether it's a company or a council, that isn't doing things properly, it's not the best place to be as a building inspector, is it?
True.
It's about making sure that those values are aligned between the organisation and the individual. I don't know whether that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it does. It was part of my question as well, was people taking the competency assessments when there is so much inconsistencies between the three schemes.
Yeah.
And how we can align the three schemes so that it's fair for everyone.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've just said how I qualified, I think, when I introduced myself. I mean, I ended up I did 7 Part 2 exams because I didn't have a degree. those with degrees that were exempt from those. And they took me through things like management subject matter, fire studies, legal and regulatory control, and structures and geotechnics, and a couple of other subjects that have long since faded into my memory. At part 3, we did advanced fire safety. We did advanced regulatory and legal and regulatory control, and we actually ended up sitting a 7.5-hour exam to check a plan that was delivered to you on the day. So you ended up sort of getting 15 minutes to look through the exam, and then you had literally 2 sets of questions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And I suppose that you either liked exams or you didn't. I personally hated them, you know. You were prepared for those in a very contrived classroom type. You know, you didn't need to do them, but you were prepared for them in a classroom environment where colleges supported that application process. The Association of Building Engineers, that was called something else back then, and it escaped me what it was called. The Association of Building Engineers, they had a more contrived practical approach that didn't tend to be as classroom controlled. The other thing that we needed to do, even having passed those series of exams, we had to do a 10,000 word dissertation and also keep a diary for 2 years minimum. I've still got them up at my shelf. I could literally get them for you now and show them to you, but in fact, it's probably not a bad thing to actually do. So we took a very contrived route to our education and training. There's my
That was quick.
there's my it's literally on a shelf that's above me. There's my dissertation that was about fire engineering applications within the historical city of Bath, and that was my professional diary that was filled with various different examples, handwritten in those days. There was no such thing as typewriting capability. But that's what we had to do back then. Now, what you've actually got is that you've got 2 routes. You've got either the examination route, which is run by the BSCF, perfectly legitimate for those who like exams, but you're not going to be able to capture everything. And there's only 3 bands. So you've got band A, which effectively qualifies the 2A surveyors, those that are responsible for domestic construction up to 3 stories, if you like. And then you have band B, which captures things from anything which isn't that, up to 18 meters in height. And I suppose if I was looking for gaps in that assessment system, it's quite possible to pass with, say, 50% and become a registered 2F building inspector.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, you've probably never looked at a 2F building in your life, and you may have got all the questions wrong on the exam. So it isn't perfect, but at least they've done something to make sure that they're qualifying, to make sure that they're tested, to make sure that their background. So for each of them, for each system, we need to build up quite a substantial portfolio of practical application of our skills at the level at which we're going. Band C is pretty much the same. You know, you're going to end up with possibly 3G experts getting 3H projects. And I think it's quite important that the breadth of that exam and the breadth of the experience is considered together to make sure that they've actually got the capability. I do wonder how many people who've passed the band B have registered anything else but for classes A to F. And maybe they should be a little bit more reflecting on what their capabilities are, and hold back that registration at that particular level, because, you know, capability is built quite slowly than building control. It takes years to build the knowledge up about the technical subject. I've probably forgotten more about technical than I remember these days, but
I think they have created a new one, the BSCF, which will get you class A, B, and D. So that they've
excellent.
done another one for that. But I do have an ex-colleague that got 2A to F, but they made it clear that some of those projects they wouldn't ever have been involved in.
And
And
that's the principles of our code, isn't it? Making sure that anything that you're incapable of doing, you declare the fact that you don't feel confident doing it, and you pass it on to a colleague.
yeah, he wouldn't get involved in those types of things, but that was the only one at the time which was available. But if the 2A, B, and D one was, he would have sat that instead of, because that is more what he gets involved in.
It's good that they're sort of doing that, because that's the majority. That's probably 80% of English and Welsh applications, isn't it? That 2A, B, and D stuff. 2C, which is buildings between 11 and 18 meters, and 2F, which is buildings between 11 and 18 meters, but in the commercial sector. They're probably the most complex buildings that you're actually going to come across. And they're not that much different between the 3G and 3H buildings, to be fair, in terms of their requirement. It's only a subtlety in the law, in the application of Reg 7 2 through to 4 that changes, really. But the requirements are pretty much the same.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on, because I myself am a class 2 A, B, C, and D.
Mm-hmm.
I've got class C, and I've worked on many classes C buildings.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on recently having class 2Cs being able to do some elements in HRBs? Obviously not everything, but there was, I think, a limitation in a couple of elements in that they can carry out.
Yeah, I think what's actually appeared on the register now is that the capability of 2Cs and 2Fs working on buildings above 18 meters, but only within Cat B works, so the minor works, so anything which doesn't, say, affect the common areas or isn't significant to it. So if you're doing a bathroom alteration within a flat, provided that, say, the lobby protection of the staircase enclosure isn't affected, or you're just materially altering it so it doesn't worsen it from a Reg 3.2 point of view, then generally speaking, it's no bad thing. It sorts out the resource. It actually introduces, under supervision, the capability of the 2Cs, the 2Fs, to actually evolve into 3G and H surveyors. So I think it's no bad thing. I think it almost in every organization, if you were to say, what's the challenge that you have with your people? It's mentoring them. And when you have so few class 3 inspectors, the time spent with individuals to actually grow, I think we need more education and training, hopefully sponsored by government, to actually introduce, say, a building safety college. And I must admit, I was part of a group that's already spoken to government about this quite some time ago. And there just wasn't the investment available at the time to be able to do it. But we have a very, very good facility in Morton in the Marsh in the Fire Safety College, which I believe is run by a private company now. They train the fire brigade. And when you look at the, when you actually look at the capability of duty holders, you could run from that facility. If you transferred it to a building safety college, you could run from that facility a training program with exams, with qualifications at the end of it, that would allow people to classroom learn the 3G, the 3Hs, and also going into the 2Cs and the 2Fs, because it is more difficult to actually mentor them, because there's so few buildings about that to which you're going to be exposed. And of course, people have business pressures, both within local authority in terms of their available resource, and also RBCAs have the same issue. And their time is being taken up by the BSR actually considering these applications. So I think a more contrived route towards education and training could be taken. I'd love to see more degrees in building control. I had a colleague of mine that actually helped write the apprenticeship degree for University College of Estate Management. And also there's a non-cognate level 7 degree there, an MSc, which receives virtually no interest for people who are qualified in something else and want to transfer over. But it's only going to be led by interest, and it needs more interest in the actual course. And it needs to be widely advertised, but also duty holders as well you could run a postgraduate diploma in principal design activities, couldn't you? You could build up that knowledge. How many people have we all spoken to in the last few years where you're turning around since the introduction of the duty holders and saying, actually, your responsibilities are really no different to what they have been for the past 30 odd years, since Murphy versus Brentwood came in. And I know that people have been poking at that legislation, but the two most recent cases tend to reinforce it within the private sector. Um, you know, how about them actually knowing what building control, how work is actually controlled, the knowledge of buildings regs 3, 4, 5, and 6, 22, 23, for renovation of thermal elements and that sort of thing. How many of those architects actually know that that's the starting point to know what
Yes.
work is actually controlled? And they're not getting it in universities. I was chatting to a building surveyor only yesterday, and I turned around and said, how many days of tuition did you get about building regulations? And I think he said it was about 4. And the building regulations for him at the time were the green books, they were the approved documents. And they only really covered the major ones, Part A, B, L, and M. So that were the only aspects that he actually covered, but they didn't ever cover the basics of building control. So I think there's an opportunity to actually classroom teach duty holders and give them a postgraduate or a diploma in building regulations or building safety, call it what you like. And I think there's enough of us in the industry with enough experience to be able to tutor that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we could do so fairly philanthropically, to be fair, and actually make sure that worked and we're building capability for the future in a very prescriptive way. So education and training can certainly be built, but otherwise mentoring is difficult when there's so few people. You don't want to have a group of 7 class 2 Cs and Fs behind you when you're doing an inspection on a class 3 building. I don't think the builder's going to be too tolerable of that, do you, from his health and safety point of view?
In respect of training then and the duty holders, do you think there is an opportunity available for principal contractors to have some form of additional education into what their roles are and the understanding of the regulations? There's many times on site where I think people still want to be told the answer, and you sort of leading them back to the principal designer to sort of give them a bit of a nudge on what they should be doing rather than saying, well, what insulation should be using, how much should be using. Do you think there's something where they could maybe have a bit of a course themselves, or do you think builders wouldn't be up for that kind of thing?
No, my experience is the opposite. They are. I mean, the larger contractors that are operating within HRBs are generally serving a JCT contract where they're both the principal designer and the principal contractor. And then they're responsible for putting in place a lead architect that actually shapes the project management, if you like, and undertakes some of their duties. But it's an individual within that contracting firm that signs as a principal designer at the end of the day. It's just the way that their contracts tend to work. And yes, I do believe that they're interested. I do believe that they're building in capability as well. Certainly the people that I'm supporting in that is, that they're very aware of their duties, very aware in some sense, I mean, of their shortcomings, but really they do it well. They do the project management very well. And for the management side of it, when you're actually talking about, the prescriptive, when you're a principal designer and you're an architectural lead, if you like, the sole designer, you're always going to have people like structural engineers, fire engineers, mechanical and electrical engineers that you need to operate with, because simply you won't have the knowledge of them. And similarly, the contractor is relying on designers to actually make sure that they're having regard to the subcontractor management, making sure that they have live change control mechanisms in place, that the documents are continuously updated, because building control's slightly changed, as you implied, Jack. When we get out onto site, we're not necessarily undertaking inspections in exactly the same way as we used to. I say we. I'm just a consultant these days, but if I was to go out to a building site now and undertake an inspection on a 3H building, my way of questioning is to say, how have you, can I have a look at your records for compliance of this, please? Can I have a look at your photographic evidence? Have any major changes actually been undertaken? Are they notifiable? Are they major? Do they need to be notified to the building safety regulator with further details? How have you controlled those changes? How has it affected your other documents, such as building control compliance statements, that sort of thing? The questioning from a registered building inspector on those jobs, I think, has changed slightly. It can be interpreted at Gateway 2 as being a full stop rather than a hard stop. Once those documents, those periphery documents that are in place, those supplementary documents that go in with a class 3 building, like the building control compliance statement, the fire and emergency file, the change control file, and the others, all of those things are live documents that are updated during the construction, because they do form part of your Gateway 3 application. Now, if we take that as a QMS approach towards class 3 buildings, there's more and more and more of this going on within the general low-rise stuff as well. How many times have you seen the architect take control? Because I'm seeing it increasingly by actually seeking out PD support from somebody like me or whatever, and actually making sure that they're asserting compliance in their own version of a plan check, where they can say, Part A, structure, refer to such and such a plan. It shouldn't be the building inspector's job to actually find this information out of thousands and thousands of bits of submissions. It should be individually navigated to the actual appropriate parts of those documents. And it applies just as much for small builds as it does for large.
Yeah, I've found a lot of architects that I've been dealing with, or principal designers, have sort of changed their tact on how they're laying out the plans they're sending over. There'll be a good spec sheet which will label it Part A, Part B, and then within their drawings, they'll also sort of indicate noted within this section, or this is discussed here, that's discussed there, and they will refer to structural engineer design or detail, which it does make the task of plan checking much quicker and easier to do, and provide any sort of feedback in a lot better time than having to go through 5 or 10 different documents, all with different things on different pages, all jumbled together, which can be a
I
struggle.
mean, you never get away from that on the smaller stuff, will you? You won't. You'll never get away from it. All we can hope for is that the architects actually respond positively and make sure they navigate us to the relevant information using things like building control compliance statements, going back to the basics to decide which aspects of that work is controlled, making sure that they're familiar with their other risks, such as, workplace health and safety. So if you're dealing with a material change of use and you have a Part K issue, which isn't controlled inside the building regulations, that they have regard to their Health and Safety at Work Act general duties, because it's a bit like the RBC regs that we always call the RBC regs, but they're called the RBC etc regs, the Registered Building Control Approver etc regulations. And the etc is because it prescribes the activities of local authority building control when they're considering the reversion of applications, and I wonder how many people actually realise that. Health and safety legislation is exactly the same. It's the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Health and Safety at Work etc Act. And the etc is because there's general duties to make sure that the people who are in journey circulation, say for instance around a hotel, that there is adequate provision of risk assessment of existing features such as staircases, to actually make sure that they have a safe environment for those going around their business, and anything which isn't necessarily as regulatory compliance as it could be, or that doesn't comply with the associated code of practice that supports the workplace regulations, the alterations are put in place to actually mitigate those risks. So I think that it's more than just about building control. It's making sure that if you are a designer, that you're aware of these legal responsibilities.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the topic of classes of registration
Sure.
and ask you if there's any further clarity, because recently the representatives from the three competency schemes has said that some RBIs that are not carrying out restricted activities within their class of registration may not be able to re-register for that class when the re-registration comes up.
It's all about experience. I mean, it's funny enough. I was chatting with one of Dave Barley's colleagues earlier today about this subject. And there has been a change in personnel in the BSR most recently, and it is a question that the competency schemes have put to the new person, if you like, about what happens in the future. I mean, somebody can be capable. I've just lost my capability, haven't I? Because I've left building control approvers. I'm not gonna consult back into RBCAs or local authority building control to undertake class 3. So in a couple of years' time, if we're on the trajectory that I believe that we're on at the moment, that if I'm not active within building control, even though I'm supporting clients within the HRB environments and what have you, and I've probably got a better than average idea about what I'm supposed to be doing, then essentially, that needs to be accounted for. And there is the potential, because so many people have gone out to support clients, that we will no longer be flexible enough to come back into building control bodies and actually act. So I wonder whether or not there is a route for consultants to actually qualify and maintain their class of registration, because it does give them some flexibility. But the point is, the competency bases that we've got at the moment always rely on a professional portfolio to demonstrate how you're working, even if it's under supervision, in order that you can go through the classes. I mean, I qualified somebody yesterday at 3G who was perfectly able and knew the limitations of his knowledge to date. His portfolio wasn't extensive in 3G. He had a couple of projects. They were fairly basic, but they fitted within buildings that were much more complex. He was aware of the work that he needed to do to support his own education and training moving into the future. I'm fairly convinced within the organisation that he worked that the training plan was in place to only make sure that he's getting better. And this is where that synergy between the RBI and the RBCA or the LABC actually comes in place, to make sure that they're getting their mentored supervision, to allow people to move between the classes, to maintain their registration. It's to the advantage of the organisation, right? Because essentially, you've got a continuity plan for the rest of the existence of the company.
Yeah.
We have the likes of LABC and TTD and CAVE that provide forms of training and qualifications. Do you think it would be beneficial for LABC to not just offer it to local authority members, but also all RBIs, as we are supposed to be collaborating and working together as a whole? So do you not think it could be a missed opportunity for LABC to also give, the possibility for all RBIs, regardless of what sector they work in, to have access to some of these CPD?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's like anything, isn't it? There are commercial pressures. It does exist within a competitive marketplace. We don't want to they don't want to necessarily reveal all their secrets in exactly the way as an RBCA wouldn't want to reveal the secrets. But if it's pure technical training and if it benefits the audience, yeah, of course, it should be offered to all. That's the way I would say, anyway. We do work within a competitive environment, and you've got to realise that effectively, wherever you've got competition, you're always going to have some reluctance to open that up, because they get direct access. They don't want RBCAs to have direct access to their staff by putting Jack in there or Nader in there or Andy in there as a spy, so we can target people directly. I mean, I think we're a bit beyond that. I think we're working more collaboratively with LABC, the ABCA, more so than ever before, to be honest. But it's yeah, I think the issue is that we need to take a fairly contrived approach towards that. I think you need to respect the competitive aspect. I mean, looking at the return that the ABCA put in, they're fairly bullish that they can actually cope with the pressures that they're put under. I understand that resource isn't always there, but it is up to the organisation to control the inputs from, show how people can alter practices and sort out their approach dependent on the resource that they actually have and the capability that they have within the organisation. I get the fact that everybody's a little bit short of resource, but it comes down to management of that, I think. And to maximise the technical help that you can give to RBIs would be great. I just wish it was given more philanthropically, not just by LABC, but by the private sector as well.
In respect of competition, I think we've spoken before regarding the consultation in respect of fees and how there may be fees introduced for initial notice for checking purposes.
Uh-huh.
What's your thoughts on how that's going to affect the private sector, or if that's going to be done correctly? Or I know local
Well, it'll be
authority, when
done.
I was there, I
I
didn't
can.
see too much of it being checked for initial notice. It was usually just lapsed after the 5 days and deemed as accepted.
Well, that they can do, and they wouldn't necessarily need to. They wouldn't charge for that, would they? Because they're not doing anything in return. And the SIPFA rules, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting, they dictate what local authorities can actually charge for on a cost recovery basis. So they all run this balanced trading account, and they need to account for every penny that they've actually got. So I don't necessarily disagree with the principle of them charging for that work, but obviously I think that the central argument is that they're trying to level the competitive playing field. And, that there's when you apply to a local authority to register initial notice, doesn't need to be done within the building control section. It just needs to go through the front door of a local authority to be legally served, doesn't it? So I get that. What they're trying to do is they're trying to introduce sort of a competitive playing field. They're trying to strengthen public sector capacity. I don't think that the fees that they could charge in relation to this are going to strengthen RBI development, but it could certainly strengthen and maybe provide them with one administrator or whatever to look at those notices. It gives a short-term pro-competitive boost. The argument states that they're strengthening local authority building control and they're using it maybe would increase a practical consumer choice, but I don't necessarily think that it would. That they're looking to sort of resource an improvement in quality and compliance. I suppose the cons against it is that there may well be a direct financial impact on RBCAs. Obviously, that direct impact is going to be passed on to the clients. There is a reduction in RBCA competitiveness, but I don't think that people compete on fees at the moment, and it may well result in the smaller RBCA companies disappearing into the larger RBCA companies, which would be a shame because we're seeing a lot of market consolidation at the moment and reduction in diversity. The point is that smaller RBCA firms may end up with less capacity due to absorbing increasing costs. And they may well be forced to either sell or exit the market. You never know. And I guess the devil is in the detail, isn't it? I mean, if you've got an estate of 200 houses or 300 or 400 houses, which you see registered by, say, the NHBC, the administration of that isn't much different in terms of the initial notice of a single-story extension. But the administration, when it comes to the closure of that notice, as each individual plot needs to be commenced within the 3 years, that becomes a bit of a challenge. And they just need to make sure that they're going to charge fees at a reasonable level to actually cover that administrative function. But if you were a local authority taking 300 applications a year and you're charging 100 quid or 110 quid to actually cover the expense of that one administrative post, I don't think it's a massive cost. But in the bigger scheme of things, our clients are also going to be hit by levies soon on housing, and it's increasing the burden on developers, isn't it? When they've got to start compensating RBCAs for the cost of the local authority administration, and also making sure that the building safety levy is actually settled. So the devil's going to be in the detail, I think. As I say, I don't think that the administration should be too much different until the close of that mass housing site, where they're actually checking what's been started and what's not. But they could just as easily do that through law and actually get a statement put in by the RBCA after 3 years to say there's been 200 plots started here. Here's a new initial notice for the other 100, which we envisage to commence, but they haven't yet. So here's a new initial notice. They'll have to obey this updated regulation or whatever. So I get it, but in reality, the devil's going to be in the detail, isn't it? And without knowing the proposed level of the new charges, any assessment's purely speculative. A modest charge that covers actual costs may effectively level the playing field. However, a higher charge could be crippling to RBCAs. And the statement underplays, I think, the long-term risks. While the short-term benefits to the local authority building control are clear, the long-term risks to RBCA are reasonably serious depending on the size of the company. The potential for market consolidation and reduced provider diversity poses a big threat to the healthy competitive marketplace that we all intend to benefit from.
Andy, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on our podcast. I think it's only fair before we end this very interesting and insightful episode, would like to hear one last thought from yourself. I know you're passionate about training and having next generation ready for the future. What is something that you want to see happen right now to drive that push?
I would love to see. Construction suffers a really bad image, doesn't it? When you nobody wants their child to go in onto a building site. They see them looking 50 at the age of 30 because they're all windblown and windswept. What I'd really like to see is a national careers agency at senior school level and a sponsored event, say within the NEC on a yearly basis, where people could actually, where Mr. and Mrs. Smith could take Johnny and Jenny to actually investigate their career options. And I don't think that there would be any trouble with national industry, national approved inspectors, surveyors, whatever it actually is, structural engineers, actually sponsoring that event, actually putting stands up, actually providing staff once a year to increase the interest in construction generally. The CIC, the wider Construction Industry Council, not the SICA, but the CIC has a future skills group, where LABC are offered the opportunity to comment, and also the ABCA is offered the opportunity to comment and have regular attendees at that group. I would love to see a greater, wider interest being promoted by a national careers agency, and a much more contrived approach towards construction education. I really do. And also that the continuation of that building safety college, if you like, to make sure that we're shaping the already qualified surveyors and the duty holders and assuring them that they're not going to hit too many pitfalls and they're setting themselves up to succeed by better education. But I think that starts quite early. I'd like to see education and training and the opportunities for construction pushed much more by industry in partnership with government using events that government, if they're cute about it through sponsorships, could actually make sure that the industry is paying to promote itself. The CIC group that I was involved with is local, and I went down on behalf of CABE at the time to actually talk. And the frustrations were they were looking at people like me, or people like the local structural engineer or architect or building surveyor or CITB professional, advertising the wares of bricklaying and apprenticeships in carpentry and that sort of thing. Their only way of promoting at the time was to actually use the volunteers that were present around that table to go out with a bit of a poster and talk to careers within their chosen schools. Do you know what I mean? If we ensured better access for all by a more contrived event, I think it would serve construction so much better than it does at the moment. It's not just about building control, it's about making sure that we're promoting construction into the future, because there's lots more career opportunities than looking windswept at the age of 50.
Andy, one more thing before we end is I'm sure a lot of companies may be interested in getting in contact with yourself to potentially have some CPD events or get some of their staff training. What would be the best place to get your information, your website, your email address?
Yeah, the website is www.planetbc.co.uk, and my email address is andy@planetbc.co.uk. And if you contact me via that, I'd be only too happy to help. Yeah.
And also people could find you on LinkedIn under Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Andrew
just search more for me on LinkedIn. I'm not as brave as you, Nader, so I don't post an awful lot. I'm a dyslexic scouser, and at the end of the day, anything that I write is, I always make errors in it, so I can't stand posting. I do occasionally do it, but it is infrequent. I'm better in front of people.
And we're absolutely honored and pleasure to have you, Andy, and thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts and knowledge and experience with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me, guys.
Cheers. Thank you.
Enjoy your weekends.
You too.
Cheers.